This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with amazing humans who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and there's much chatter about building, scaling, and growing a business. But what happens after you built, scaled, and grown that business? Well, that's where Sharon Heaton comes in. Sharon is the founder of sbLiftOff, a firm serving commercial and government contracting companies, and the author of the book, LiftOff, 12 Things to Know Before You Sell Your Company. Sharon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I got to start, it's silly, but I'm going to start with talking about small business, which is probably a good idea since that's kind of your bag. So I'm originally from the New York and New Jersey area, and I didn't really deal with a lot of small businesses because I was a renter and I didn't have to deal with tradesmen and stuff like that. But 4 years ago, I moved down to Charleston, South Carolina, built a home, and then I realized, oh, wow, I figured out the reason why many small businesses fail. They suck at small business. And I don't mean the actual work. I mean all of the soft skills that are required, like returning a phone call, arriving on time for an appointment. And I was like, for years, I always wondered, man, I feel bad for small businesses. Any chance I can get, I'll go to a restaurant as opposed to a chain. But I didn't realize what the issues were. And obviously, they're bigger than my complaints. But tell me about the issues that small businesses run into when it comes to being their own worst enemy.
Absolutely. Our education system trains people to be employees. It basically says, sit in your seat, do these tasks. This is how you're going to succeed. You're going to get an A if you do the following things. And that really sets you up for having a job where you're basically going to have a boss and they're going to tell you what to do, etc. When you start your own company, you're responsible for everything. Not simply the delivery of the work, but as you said, the returning of the phone call, the making sure that there's air in the tires so that people can get to where they need to go in the next morning. It's a job that's 24/7. And the reality is, most people don't form a company. And those people who form a company, most of them fail. And even those who are successful can keep it going for about 5 years. It's the really rare person who's able to form a company, make it successful, and keep it going for 5, 10, 15 years. And those people ultimately are the backbone of the U.S. economy. What they do is very, very hard. And most people can't do it. For the first time in my career, I now have a small business. And it's overwhelming. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking about it. It's very different than when you have a job. So yes, the complaints that you have are absolutely legitimate. And those are people who are not going to do very well. But I find that many small businesses are unbelievably client-oriented and really want to be a good provider to their clients.
No, and I've had overwhelmingly good experiences with the folks I work with. It's just that I was always trying to figure out in my brain why these companies have so much trouble. And also, what you were talking about, Sharon, you can sort of make it very applicable to big businesses. When you see these tech entrepreneurs, people that run large companies, they may be the quote unquote subject matter expert, but they're terrible at being bosses. So the same rules apply. At the end of the day, they're humans dealing with the same thing. But obviously, when you're dealing with SMBs, smaller scale, higher risk, the reward maybe not as great. But yeah, I think it's a lot of it's the human side of small business, right, Sharon?
The human side of small business is incredibly important. And in the book that I wrote, I really spent a long time talking about those emotions because there's too many people who think of business and only think about it in terms of the numbers. And the numbers are important. I don't mean to imply that it's not. But it's also important to think about who are the people that are actually delivering the products and services and what are the dynamics that are going on in their organizations. Over the last 15 or 20 years, probably longer than that, there's been a lot of talk about the culture of organizations and how leaders should deal with their people and how people should deal with their bosses. And I think part of that is the outgrowth of what you're talking about, Joe, that there's so much more to business than simply delivering the product and service and getting paid for it. There's so many wraparound elements to it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have a running joke on this Sharon podcast where I always say that entrepreneurs are psychopaths. I don't know why they do it to themselves. Like you mentioned at the top, would it be just to get a job? But, after speaking to, entrepreneurs for the last 4 or 5 years, I get it. It just, to me, I always do like, oh, let me put myself in there, but let me see how it is. And I'm like, I don't want to, Sharon, I don't want to be waking up at 3:00 in the morning wondering if my business is going to be okay. And the other part of it, Sharon, is that no other person is going to care about your business than you. It's almost like your family. It's no one's going to, as much as, I feel bad for this person or like that, like no one is going to care about the business and waking up at 3:00 in the morning as much as you. So this is where I think it talks about the idea of culture in a small business, where you have to find people that maybe they won't love it as much as you, but man, they really, really have to respect the snot out of you and love what they do.
Here's the reality, and I found it surprising, particularly as I began to experience it. Being a leader in a small company is actually a very lonely position because you think about the business all the time, but I promise you, your partner or spouse doesn't want to hear about it all the time. And your employees are looking to get a break from the business because they're not owners to it. And the people that you spend your social time with, they want to talk about things other than your business. So it's actually pretty important that business owners find a place where they can go and really talk about what's on their mind and what's bothering them. And I find that a lot of them are, in fact, feeling a little alienated and lonely because they don't know where to go to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hear this about big business too. Like the loneliest position in any company is the CEO because, again, they can't relate to it. Their spouse probably like, leave that shit at the office. I don't want to deal with it here.
I don't want to hear about it.
So I get it and totally sympathize with them. And you mentioned your book, and the big sort of like log line of it is selling the business, which is, like you referred to, you have a successful business that runs 5, 10, 20 years, but then eventually you don't want to do it anymore, or you can't do it anymore. There comes a certain time where you're like, hey, listen, I can't deal with the grind. I can't deal with having to wake up at 3:00 in the morning and doing so. So let's talk about LiftOff and the idea of selling a business. What was the inspiration for this kind of book? Because there's a lot of business books out there about small businesses, and it's always about how to make it work. What do you do to be successful? But the idea of making the jump to building the business to then selling the business, I think for many small business owners, Sharon, that seems like that could be another lifetime or another universe that you're discussing. But tell me about the idea of selling a business.
I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about myself, because I started my career working in publicly traded companies with, very large multi-billion-dollar companies. And then over time started working in the PE market. It's only the last 10 years or so that I've begun working with the founder owner, the person who sat at their kitchen table and came up with an idea and turned that idea into money. It's a really hard thing to do. And I found myself absolutely drawn to these people. They are a challenge because they're doing things their own way for a long time. But there are some rights and wrongs when it comes to selling your company. I spend a huge amount of my time at this point talking to small business owners to talk to them about, is your company sellable? What is the process? How do you maintain confidentiality? And a similar list of things. As I started writing the book, I said to myself, what I need to do is write down what I say to these people. This is information that every small business owner can use. One of the first chapters is my company sellable? Because very often people are so tied to their company that the company doesn't really exist without them. And if the company doesn't exist without that owner, then there is no company to sell. So finding out how important that business owner is to the company is incredibly relevant to determining whether or not that company is sellable. It's actually surprising. I turn to business owners and say, you're too important. We need to make you less important in order to make your company more important and hence transferable. But these are the kind of issues.
Can we dive into that for a second, Sharon?
Sure.
Is the idea of like making someone less important. Boy, I don't know if anyone would want to pay someone to tell them how to be less important, but I wonder what that struggle is like in terms of, and obviously you're using the broad term of less important, but it's more of like, how do they pull away from something that is ingrained in their soul? I mean, I would imagine it when you come to that decision of selling is hard enough, but then to then be told, hey, listen, yeah, you can sell this company, but you're actually the reason people will want to buy it. How do these small business owners deal with that?
Well, it's a bit of a shock. And here's why. Because you can't buy the owner. You can buy the company. And what happens is that sometimes a business owner will set themselves up so that they really just have a job and they have other people helping them do their job. Well, that's great, but it's not sellable. You need to actually have an entity that is functioning without the owner. I'll turn to an owner and I'll say, okay, God forbid you walk out into the parking lot and you get struck by lightning. What happens to your company the next day? And the people who lose their mind at that and say, well, if nothing happens, the company is going to collapse. It's like, well, then you don't have a company. What you have is a job. And we need to turn it into a company. There need to be people there who can make decisions, who are empowered to do things besides you. Otherwise, it's really not a company, it's just a job.
And how does one do that when, I'm just trying to think the sort of the practical way of doing so, because if it's, say, a small business where maybe this owner is one of 5 employees and the 4 other people don't have the skill set that he does. They're probably experts in doing whatever the thing they do within the company, but the owner is the one who is sort of, for lack of a better word, the engine of it. How does an owner then pull away from that when they are not, and not to say, Sharon, they're not important or unimportant. It's just the fact that they literally are the company.
If they're literally the company, then nobody can buy the company because, we're not allowed to buy people anymore. That's not we can't do that. We tend to work with companies that have about 10 million in revenue and above. So when you're first starting a company and you're really in that startup phase, hey, that business owner is the chief cook and bottle washer. They're doing everything. But over time, you need to start shedding responsibilities and you need to hand the finance over to somebody, maybe the business development over to somebody, the execution work. And if you're doing all of those things, then what is that somebody going to part of building a company is building a functioning machine. And you've got to have a machine that's outside you as the business owner. So you really can't do it when you're really tiny, when you've got 5 people, 4 people. We talk about businesses that are $3 or $4 million as being main street businesses. And many of them, in fact, will not be sellable because the business owner is, in fact, the business. Once you get past that main street part and you get to be a $5, $6, $8 million company, you should then be thinking about the company as separate from the person. And that, of course, becomes easier to do as the company gets bigger. But that transition is very much a challenge for a lot of small business owners.
And Sharon, the work you do and we're talking about and in the book, is it industry agnostic? Is it any industry? Are there certain industries that maybe you have more expertise in helping with or that the book could help with? What is your take on that?
The book is written for business generally. Basically, again, companies with 10 million to 100 million in revenue, which bizarrely enough is considered the lower mid-market. The mid-market goes up to $1 billion in revenue.
Jeez.
Well, I don't know who the heck is doing $1 billion in revenue as a medium-sized business, a small business, but so be it. We're focusing on that particular part of the market. The book is actually written to be industry agnostic because so many of the things that we're doing are in fact just the normal work for M&A. Having said that, I then added a chapter for the industry that we work in at sbLiftOff, and that industry is government contracting. And government contracting are basically the companies that provide goods and services to the federal government. There are a lot of differences there, so I did a separate chapter on it. And I did it for 2 reasons. One is people who know me will say, well, what about government contracting? So I put it in there. And second, to say, if and when you're choosing an M&A advisor, please make sure that you choose somebody who knows your industry, not somebody who's going to be learning about it for the first time. If you were getting your hip replaced, you don't want to go to a doctor that's doing it for the 3rd time. You want a doctor who does it day in and day out. And it's the same thing when you're choosing your M&A advisor, your lawyer, your accountant. You want somebody who understands the world in which your business lives. So there is some element of understanding that industry, but the basic process is laid out in the book.
All right, so let's give the boomers some love because I know recently the baby boomer generation has gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to millennials and Gen Z and Gen Y. But there's a stat that 10,000 baby boomers retire every day, which is pretty remarkable, 10,000. And what that means is that there's a potential silver tsunami, is what Cody Sanchez calls it, the number of boomers that are retiring that have small businesses to sell. She talks about the fact that we see something like 10 or 11 million small businesses for sale in the U.S. any 3-year moving period. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to acquire businesses that are in the small and medium business world, but also that these boomers have something to sell. They have something to offer. As much as, like I said, as much as they've been getting shat on a bit over the last few years, they do have something to offer for the next generation. Can you tell me about what your thoughts are on this silver tsunami?
Silver tsunami is real, and it's been going on for a while. In fact, boomers started turning about retirement age around 2008. 2008, 2009 was not a great time to try and sell your company. So a lot of them kind of held off then. And there were a lot of transfers that occurred between, let's say, 2012 and 2016 or 17. But there was still a fairly significant backup of these companies. Now, again, you've got to look at these companies in lots of different ways. Most companies are kind of a pyramid. At the bottom part are the smallest companies. And as you move up and get larger in companies, that it becomes a pyramid. There's fewer and fewer of them. For the really small companies, it might very well be that it's in fact a job, not a company. And you might be able to transfer that to somebody who wants that as a job, but that's going to be a very different transaction than if in fact you've got a company where, let's say, the business owner can go away for a week or two and the company continues to function. I use that as one of the measures as to whether or not somebody has a job or has a company. If the company can't function, if they're not there, there's something wrong. So there's a huge silver tsunami coming. There's going to be a massive generational shift of wealth. And baby boomers are sometimes a little freaked out by it. I was working on a transaction a couple of years ago with a husband and wife, and they had a woman-owned company. They'd made a lot of money. They were very successful. They were thinking about selling the company. And I said, listen, we're going to have to find a woman or deal with this woman-owned issue. And the husband got really kind of frustrated and said, well, this is crazy. We're not going to go through this process. It takes too long. It's too expensive. We're not going to do it. We'll just close down the company. And I stopped and I thought for a second and I said, well, you have 350 employees. What are you going to do about those people? And he stopped and he said, we're going to sell the company. It's really important to understand that a company is not just an entity, it's an ecosystem. It's got people who work there. It's got vendors who sell to it. It's got clients who depend upon it. And that entity is valuable in the economy, and we want to make sure that it gets handed off in an appropriate way, in a fair way, to both the buyer and the seller, but not taking value out of the pockets of employees, certainly providing the customers with the same level of service. And so it's a complicated process, and people need to be willing to kind of give and take a little bit in it.
I know you mentioned this a couple of times, but it's not a company, it's a job. When you tell people this, I'm just curious, what's the reaction from people who we tell? Because at the end of the day, you're just giving them the cold hard truth.
And people don't always like hearing that, I have to say.
Right.
I was talking to a business owner, and I was sitting in his conference room, and we were talking about his company. It was about a $20 million company, and it was reasonably successful. As we were sitting there, it was a food services preparation company, and they delivered all over the country. Different employees would run in and say, oh, the sink is backed up. Oh, Mary has not shown up for work. And each of these employees was turning to the business owner to say, what should we do? And after about an hour of this, and probably 4 or 5 interruptions, I turned to the business owner and said, you have a job. How is somebody going to come in here and do this? And he said, well, somebody else would just have to play the same role that I do. I said, well, nobody's going to do that. You're working 90 hours a week. You're making decent money. That's great. But they're looking to have a company, not to step into something that's really not been organized right. For that situation, we were able to work with him to make the changes necessary. And it really was about making him less important and the company stronger. There needed to be a secondary management team. There needed to be people who made decisions when the sink was backed up, that question didn't get brought to the CEO, but rather other people knew what to do.
Wow. And was there a happy ending to that story, Sharon? Or?
It was a very happy ending. He was able to transfer and did quite nicely in that. But it took him a couple of years to make the changes because he very much wanted to go to market immediately, and it just wasn't feasible. But he was able to make those changes over a period of years. There's an analogy of letting go of the vine. That is, you're falling, and you hold on to something to kind of get some stability. But sometimes you have to let go. And business owners are often very much a control freak. That's why they're starting their own company. They really want to control everything. But it's working with people and having other people do their jobs and you not doing their jobs for them. So it is very difficult for business owners, But when they get there, they say, what did I wait so long? This is a much better way to live. This is far more sustainable. And I get to say, and oh, by the way, your company's now much more profitable.
Wow. And I guess the guy found a plumber to fix anything that...
He found a plumber. He found what to do about Mary. He found what to do about the refrigeration. And other people were able to do their jobs without him telling them all the things that needed to be done.
Oh, that's great. All right, let's dig into the book a little bit, Sharon. Let's talk about some of the pitfalls or trade-offs the book highlights that owners should be aware of in the sales process. And again, I want to preface this by saying this. When I interview authors, Sharon, I never want to talk about the book exclusively. That's why we're getting off, because I want people to actually read the book. But just to give us a little taste in terms of some of the pitfalls and trade-offs when it comes to that time when you decide to sell a company.
Hopefully, you start thinking about when you want to sell your company well before you really want to. If somebody comes to sbLiftOff and says, I want to sell my company, sometimes they're on their last nerve ending. They can't do it anymore. And that means that there's not going to be the time and opportunity to make changes to the company, to improve its value, to improve its positioning, to improve its marketing. That we will definitely bring those companies to market, but it makes me a little sad. Because if we were talking to people 2 or 3 or 4 years in advance, we could talk about the importance of making the business owner less important, so that you can make the kinds of transfers that you might want to. We find that sometimes people are very uncertain about what kinds of investments to make in the company or not. And when you're thinking about it from a perspective of what would a third party want, sometimes it helps clarify your thinking. There's a lot of trade-offs as you're trying to go to market. One, of course, is that business owners generally want to get 100% cash at close. Well, when you sell your house, that's what happens. But when you sell your company, it's very, very rare. And if, in fact, you were to get 100% cash, you're going to get a lower price. So there's different types of structuring, and how that structuring is done is incredibly important. Another factor is business owners will say to me on a regular basis, I don't want to sell to PE. They're terrible people. I want to sell to a strategic. Okay. And then I say, a strategic is likely to be a competitor of yours. And oh, by the way, you're going to reveal every secret you have prior to that deal closing. If that deal doesn't close, then that strategic is going to know all of that information. So there's a really good reason to sell to a strategic, but there's a trade-off to it. Private equity is not going to play those kinds of games. Now, there's downsides to private equity as well, but that's kind of the point. There are upsides and downsides to each one of these decisions, and the business owner is the one with their hand on the steering wheel, deciding which way they want to go.
Oh, that's awesome. Sarah Personette, who's currently the CEO of Puck, but she was a senior executive at Twitter, once had this quote. I love to use it from time to time. It's, business is the most personal thing in the world. Because you know how everyone says, it's not personal, it's business. And I always find like that's bullshit, because it's like, it to me, I agree with her. It's very personal. So talk about your work in the book in terms of emotionally preparing these folks to sell these companies, because, you know, I kind of joked earlier that it's sort of like part of their family. It's a child, but in essence, it is, because there's like the birthing process, the growing up process, all the growing pains. So talk about the emotional aspect of selling a company.
Joe, you were 100% right. It's an incredibly emotional process. And very often these people have been running their companies for 20 or 30 years. They've been raising their companies as long or longer than they raised their children. Now, I do like to joke that children are in fact a liability, but the company hopefully is an asset. It is such an incredible source of identity. I am this person who created this entity. I've hired these people. When I go to the country club, I put a little sticker on my chest that has my name and the name of my company. Who am I when I no longer own that company? It's really challenging. You know, when we're having children, they go through different phases. They're toddlers, they become teenagers, God forbid. Ultimately, they leave the house. It's the same thing with the company. But very often the emotions are so out of whack for the business owners that they really can't separate. I've spoken to a couple of business owners that have gone down the path of selling their company and truly in the last 48, 72 hours pulled back saying, I just can't do it. Those were people who did not face the emotions associated with selling their company. And a lot of those emotions, to be honest with you, are fear-based. Their fear that they're selling too early, their fear of selling at too low a price, their fear that employees will find out about it. They can also be very focused on the loss of identity. As I said, when you put the sign on your chest, you know who you are, but so they identify as being a business owner. And they often have a difficult time with feeling judged or inadequate. That is, they've been running their business and making all the decisions. In this process, a buyer is going to come in and start doing due diligence. Well, what is due diligence? It's essentially evaluating the company. And it is essentially a report card. It does come out with a number at the end, and that's a purchase price. But you've got to be able to separate out yourself from the company. You are not the company is not you. You have already succeeded. You did something that very few people can do for a long period of time, and you made it profitable. Be proud. You've done a tremendous service, not only for your family and your community, but for the U.S. economy. There's a time in our life that we need to move on. That's why we call our company sbLiftOff, because so many people refer to this as exit planning. And again, if you're talking about baby boomers and you're talking about exit planning, you might as well bring a coffin into the middle of the room and tell a baby boomer to lie down in it and say, does this fit? That's not what this should be about. This should be about aspirational. This should be, there are stages in your life, a stage in your life when you owned your company, and a stage in your life after you've owned it. And you should be lifting off to your next goal in life. It should be looking forward, not looking backwards.
Love that. As you're answering that, Sharon, all I'm doing is envisioning the scene from Shawshank Redemption when Brooks gets let out of prison, and then he can't grapple with being on the outside, and he's lost his identity because he was in prison for so long. There is a level of trauma, right? When you mentioned the identity and the fact that it was such a big part of their life, Sharon, when you speak to these folks after the process is done, what's it like for them?
It's a little bit like graduating from college, getting your first job, and not yet having a mortgage or kids. You've got more freedom and more flexibility and more money than you've had for a long time. And it's kind of fun. I find that when I talk to my owners who have sold, they're having the time of their life. They're traveling, they're playing golf, they're spending time with their kids. Many of them start another company because it's just so ingrained, but they're doing it because they want to, not because they have to. So it makes a huge difference, and they really like the transition. The transition can be hard because one of the things that will happen is that the buyer is likely to make different decisions than you would. That's just part of the process. And it's very frustrating when you're the one who's been making the decisions for years and saying, I know this is the right thing to do, to watch somebody else make a different decision. Sometimes it works out really well, sometimes not. But the business owner who sold made some mistakes as well. And I promise that the business owner who buys is going to make some mistakes. And the nice thing about having a business is sometimes you can make a mistake and fix it in the next year or two. And you learn as the process goes by. However, when you're selling your company, it's a one-time deal. There's no do-overs. So you got to make sure that you get it right the first time. Most business owners have 80 or 90% of their net worth tied up with that company. And so once that transaction's over, it's over. So making sure that you put a really good team around you is incredibly important. Where many business owners really feel like, I figured out myself how to run my company. Yeah, you did it over a period of years. And most business owners are humble enough to recognize that they made some mistakes. When you're actually selling your company, that's not the time to make a mistake.
That's great. That's awesome. That's such good stuff. I want to wrap this up with sort of a random question because, and kind of get into like the current economy. We're recording this in the spring of 2024. Talk of inflation, mortgage rates are out of whack. Does the socioeconomic issues affect selling a company? Because, if you talk to someone in real estate, they'll say, nobody wants to buy a house right now. The interest rates are too high. So I wonder, does any of that stuff that goes on in everyday life affect the timing of someone selling a company? Or is it just so siloed in its own world where, if the owner's ready to sell and he's got something that's attractive to a potential buyer, that it's going to be okay? Or do these other things kind of muddy the waters a little bit?
I don't think they muddy the water, but they are a little bit of a factor. There are three factors to think about when you're getting ready to sell your company. One, Are you, as the owner, ready? Are you going to pull the plug at the last minute because you can't deal with the fear or the loss of identity? What can we do to shore you up? As part of that as well, trust in estates and making sure you've done all your tax planning, incredibly important. Is the owner ready? The second is your company ready? Just because you're ready to sell doesn't mean that's the best time to sell your company. And the third is the macroeconomic environment. Yes, we've got some inflation. Yes, we have higher interest rates now than we had before. But let's be honest, interest rates are at historic norms at this point. What's been going on for the last 20 years, that's the abnormal part. I'm old enough that when I got my first mortgage, it was a 13% mortgage. And I said, I would never see a 5% mortgage. My current mortgage is at 3%. These things change. So it does have somewhat of an impact that borrowing costs are a little bit higher, but they're at historic norms at this point. When people are selling a small company, and by small, again, I'm talking about 10 to, let's say, $30 million in enterprise value, there's usually so much room for growth in that company that the cost of the capital, the debt, is not a major factor in figuring out the value. Right now, there's way more buyers than there are sellers. That gives sellers a real advantage if you've got a company worth buying.
That's awesome. Her name is Sharon Heaton. She's the founder and CEO of sbLiftOff and author of LiftOff, 12 Things to Know Before Selling Your Business. Sharon, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome, and that'll do it for another Forbes Books podcast. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and hit subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila or on TikTok at jpardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.